So, good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to our virtual iHub event titled HR Information Session. It's a little dull out here this morning from Galway. I hope you had a good summer break and that you're back into the swing of things. So, next slide there, Michelle. Our agenda today is to do with HR, and it covers critical information to do with employee contracts, recruitment and selection, employee handbook, grievance and disciplinary policy, and also an update on COVID guidance. And I'm delighted to welcome Teresa Abbey from Abbey HR here to the iHub today. So Teresa is with me in the events area in the iHub, and you know, the HR is an important area. In the last number of months, we've over 20 new hires in the Innovation Hub in Galway, and that's quite significant. But the reality is that all of those new hires need employment contracts, and all of those new hires have gone through a selection and a recruitment process. So even the employee handbook, and it's sometimes, you know, it gets forgotten about, but an employee handbook given out to everybody when they come in sort of helps to set the scene and helps to establish even, you know, what the culture of the company might look like. So we have a very important session today on HR. The whole event will be about 45 minutes in total. I'm just actually going to say a couple of words on a few awards that companies have got before we start off. So you can move to the next slide there, Michelle. So, and you can go on to the next one. So there's a number of awards I just want to say a few words on, and the first one is Blue Drop Medical. So Blue Drop Medical are a number of years with us in the iHub. They have an R&D unit and a HQ unit, and they have just recently won the 2021 Roche Diabetes Care Innovation Challenge. It's a very, very significant award, and that will allow and give the opportunity to Blue Drop Medical to help to pilot their diabetes solution with Roche. So very, very significant. What does Blue Drop do in simple terms? They're developing the first home use device to enable a thermal and visual assessment from a single daily scan to identify potential diabetic foot ulcers. So just want to congratulate Chris and the team here in the iHub on that award, very significant. They also received a few pounds to go with it, which is always very welcome. Next slide, Michelle. So the next one I want to say a few words on is Newest Surgical. Newest Surgical is a new client in the iHub, joined this year. Again, they have an R&D unit and a HQ unit here with us, and they won the Healthy Mom and Baby Innovation Competition 2 only very recently. And what that will allow them to do is to advance to an accelerator program with a number of other startups at the Matter Healthcare Incubator in Chicago. And also they have got a few pounds, which is again very welcome for startups. So what does Newest Surgical do? In simple enough terms, they're developing a novel intraoperative device called Stericision to make cesarean sections a safer, simpler and superior surgery. So well done to Barry and the team in Newest Surgical. All these awards are very important, and obviously it has the access into the States, which is hugely important for networking. So we'll go on to our third award. And these are just a number of recent ones that I've picked. There are others indeed that we didn't highlight today. We just picked a selection of 3. So the third one I picked is BioWave, and BioWave have an R&D and a HQ unit with us in the iHub. They won 2 awards. So they won the Engineers Ireland Innovative Graduate of the Year Award, sponsored by Siemens, And just prior to that, they were awarded the Social Entrepreneurs Ireland Impact Award. Two very significant events for a startup company. Again, you might say, what does BioWave do? So they're developing a customizable and accessible video game controller, allowing gamers to build their own way to play. And just as an aside, it was interesting that BioWave and Brandon himself was on the GMIT New Frontiers program last year. So congrats to Brandon and the team here in the iHub. And we look forward to seeing the product that they are developing. So we'll go on to the next slide, Michelle. So without further ado, we'll move on to the main activity of the morning. And I'd like to welcome here, because she's with me in person, which is great, I'd like to welcome Teresa to the podium to talk about a number of areas, including contracts, recruitment selection, employee handbook, grievance and disciplinary, and COVID guidance.
Thanks very much, George. And it's great to get that mask off. Good morning, everybody. And you're very welcome to my presentation this morning. I'm delighted with the opportunity to be able to give a brief overview of the HR support services that I provide to businesses throughout the country, mainly to SMEs. So I suppose by way of background, I'll give you a little bit of information about myself and how I came to where I am today. So that's, I think, on the next slide, Michelle. So many, many moons ago, when I finished school, I went on and did accounting technician and worked in various accounts, accountancy practices and accounts offices and doing payroll and so on. And it was when I was doing payroll that I developed an interest in the people side of the business. So after a number of years in accounts, I went back by night to the National College of Ireland and I studied a diploma in personnel management for 3 years. And that resulted in me working for about 10 years or so with a couple of different Irish companies doing personnel management and later moving into HR management. And just over 10 years ago, I took a leap of faith and went out on my own and providing HR consultancy to small businesses. And I've never looked back since. And it's an area that I love. I love helping small businesses who think HR is a big, bad area. And once we have a conversation, they realize it's not as bad as they think. And we get solutions fairly easily and fairly quickly to most situations. So I'll run through then on the next slide, the main areas where I provide support to companies. The first 3 topics there: recruitment, HR documentation, and people management. I have separate slides on those, so I'm going to skip over those for now and just do a little bit on the next 3. So employee communications, it could be company-wide communications. I could be contacted by companies to ask to help them with that. For example, back in 2019, when we had the snow and staff weren't able to come to work, they didn't know whether they're going to get paid or not get paid. Did they have to come to work? Did they not? Similarly, when the pandemic hit in March 2020, employers would have contacted me to say, what do we do here? So I don't have the answers to everything, but I have ways of finding out the answers. So obviously, if things pop up that are new, I have the support of IBEC. I'm a member of the Small Firms Association, a branch of IBEC, and I have their support and can always bounce stuff off them. Even if I know the answer myself, I just like that reassurance to make sure the information I'm giving to my clients is 100% current. So I could also be contacted to do individual communications. A company might have an employee who's going on maternity leave. They might never have had an employee on maternity leave before, and they might just need a little bit of guidance around what needs to be written in the letter and so on and so forth. So just general communication with staff. I'm happy to help companies with that. Moving on then to the next one, WRC preparation support. I could talk about that all day. Hopefully the companies that are here present today don't need it at the moment, and hopefully they'll never need it. But the WRC is the Work Relations Commission, and they used to be called NERA, and they are the government body that are tasked with carrying out workplace audits to ensure employees get what they're entitled to and to ensure that employers are following legislation and looking after their employees. So the Workplace Relations Commission, the WRC, can contact employers in two ways usually. So they can do on-the-spot audits where you get no notice, they just arrive in. Now they may send you a letter in advance letting you know they're going to audit you, or another way is if an employee or a former employee lodges a complaint. So I can help as much or as little as possible as much or as little as is required in the process. So sometimes I'm behind the scenes guiding the employers as to what they need to do and what they need to say, and sometimes I'm the one liaising directly with the WRC. I particularly like when making people self-sufficient themselves, and the WRC also like if the employer deals with it directly, but obviously I can be in the background supporting them. So we won't spend too much time on that. And moving on then to restructuring and redundancy. Oftentimes in companies, things change and the management want to change how things are done. This might involve employees taking on extra responsibilities. It might involve merging roles. It might involve reducing people's time. It might involve having to reduce overtime so that it's not the big overhead that it might be. And ultimately, it might involve redundancies, individual redundancies or collective redundancies. So all that type of thing I have helped companies with in the past. So if we move on to the other areas where we wanted to focus on today, so recruitment and selection. As I said, I can help companies as much or as little as is required. And I do like making companies self-sufficient. So, but I would much prefer a phone call from a company in advance of doing something so that I can set them straight as to what they should do and what they shouldn't do when it comes to recruitment or disciplinaries or any of that type of thing. So obviously with recruitment, it seems very obvious, but if you need to take somebody on, it's worth taking a bit of time to discuss internally what you want that person to do, what kind of a background they might come from, what type of a personality fit you want with the team and maybe with your customers. So there is a little bit more to taking on a person than just somebody who can actually do the task in hand. So it is worth spending a bit of time doing that. And then maybe developing a job description or developing an advert, and then deciding where is the best place to place that ad in order to target the people you want to target. So if it was a graduate, you might contact the careers office of a college. There's obviously all the social media platforms, and then also if it's more specialized, you might have to engage the services of a recruitment agency. And again, I can assist with all of that or none of that, whatever is required by the individual companies. And then following on from that, once you have identified the candidates, I often shortlist them, I often interview them, do reference checks, make the job offers and so on. Again, I can be on site or in the background guiding managers and owners through that type of thing. And once you have them employed, well, actually one other area in recruitment that I've been working in recently that I might just touch on is overseas recruitment. So it's a long process, but it looks like some companies have to do it at this present point in time. So where we don't have the people in Ireland or we can't get the staff, some companies are now going advertising abroad, or we might make connections with people abroad. And at the minute, we are hoping to have 3 Sri Lankan chefs joining a company I'm helping out at the minute. And we're hoping they'll be with us by November. We're just waiting for confirmation of the work permits that we applied for. So there is a good bit involved there in advertising, and it is a long lead-in time. And it's work in progress, so there's a lot of companies doing it, so we'll just have to see how it all works out. So moving on then, once you recruit the person, the most important thing is to get their documentation right. I particularly love when companies think what am I going to do? And we have a conversation for 10 minutes and their headache is taken off them. It's off their shoulders and it's a lot more simple than they thought. But every employee, no matter whether they're part-time, full-time, temporary, permanent, an apprentice, once you are paying them, they are an employee, even if it's only for 1 day a week. And the requirement to give them a contract and certain policy documents or a handbook is the very same as if the person was employed in the most senior role you could have in the company. So I can't stress the importance enough in just getting that paperwork right from the start. So what I tend to do, if it works with companies, is I tend to work with the company to develop a contract template that can be used time and time again. So there's a one-off cost. There may be somebody in the company who can then replicate that contract to use it for other people that are employed that might not have contracts or new staff that are taken on in the future. And then in terms of employee handbook and policy documents, I would tend to say if you have less than 10 employees, you probably don't need a handbook. They are good to have, as George said, because you can set the tone, you can put in some operational policies in it, the do's and don'ts, and give it a little bit of a feel for the structure of the organisation. But if you want a lesser spend, it is okay to just give some key policy documents along with the contract of employment. So some of those policies that are particularly important would be grievance and disciplinary. So you have to have a framework for if issues arise down the line. So that one is hugely important. If you're in front of the WRC, the first thing they look for is the employee contract, and the second thing they look for is the disciplinary policy. Other ones would be around annual leave, sick leave, what an employee has to do if they're out sick, and around whether they're paid or they're not paid, what their obligations are in terms of submitting certificates, and the employer's entitlement to send them to an occupational health practitioner if they're out for a considerable length of time, and so on. And then other policies would be health, safety and security. You might have a drugs and alcohol element in that as well. And another big one, which is a legal requirement actually, is bullying policy, or anti-bullying as I call it, anti-bullying and anti-harassment policy. So all of those, there's about 5 or 6 key ones that should accompany every contract. And then it's at management's discretion other than that as to whether they want to have an employee handbook or not. And that's something that some companies decide to do and others, because of spend, decide not to. So moving on then to people management and performance management. A lot of employers would say they'd have a great company if they didn't have any staff, but they actually wouldn't have a great company if they didn't have any staff. But managing staff can be very time consuming, and it takes managers and owners from what they want to do, which is developing their product or selling their product or whatever. But if you get it right from the start and ensure that you have the right people in the right jobs, it can be a lot smoother and easier than dealing with it when the problem arises. So right from the start, all contracts of employment would have a probationary period in it, and generally that would be 6 months, which can be extended to 11 months. So I think it's invaluable to sit down with the employee in that 6-month period. At 3 or 4 months, a lot of companies don't do it if things are going well, but you might think things are going well, but the employee mightn't. So I think it is invaluable to sit down with the employee when you're 3 or 4 months in, have a chat with them around what they think is going well, what they might need a bit of help with. And obviously you can give them a clap on the back for what they're doing well, and you can steer them in the right direction if there's areas that they need to pay more attention to or focus on, and so on. So that's the probationary period. If you are going to extend the probationary period, I'd always recommend that you do that in writing, and it can never be extended beyond 11 months, because once the employee is 12 months with you, they are covered by unfair dismissal legislation. So 11 months plus the notice period could take them over the 12 months. So 11 months is a key time, and really the 6-month probation is the key time where you're deciding the employee is a good fit or isn't a good fit. So I would help a lot of companies in that area. And then Some companies do it, not all companies, but again, I'd recommend that you would have somewhat of a formal review, either on an annual basis or every 6 months, where it's more of a formal sit down with your employees, one-to-one, because everybody is busy doing what they're taken on to do. Management and owners are busy doing what they want to do, and sometimes there's opinions and suggestions and all of that lost in that there isn't time to discuss them. So a lot of companies do find when they sit with their employees on a one-to-one, and the employees are the ones actually on the ground doing the jobs, that they actually get great insights from them as to better ways and more efficient and effective ways of doing things. So if time permits, I would recommend that that would be done. Again, I would have developed performance appraisal systems for companies, and we would have identified ways of setting the objectives and all that. But it doesn't have to be as complex as that. It can be a lot more straightforward and still effective, depending on the business itself. Where were we then? That is on the performance end of it. Moving on then to when performance isn't what you want it to be. That's when the whole disciplinary policy and procedures is crucial. So if an employee, you're trying to manage them on a day-to-day basis, and for one reason or another, it's just not working out, it is important to have that framework in place. And I would get calls, I couldn't count how many times I've got calls from owners or managers saying, Joe blogs that he hasn't done this or he has done that, and the manager couldn't take any more, or the owner couldn't take any more. So last Friday week, I called him in and I gave him a verbal warning, and lo and behold, here he is today and he's after doing the same thing. And much to the dismay of the owner or the manager or the client that calls me, the fact that they haven't followed the procedure means that verbal warning never took place. So they actually have to start the process from the start again. And it is soul destroying for owners to be told that, because they think they're now at a stage where they can bring the employee in and they can get more serious and give them a written warning. But the fact that they haven't written to the employee in advance of the first warning, they haven't written to them, they haven't put the allegation to them, they haven't allowed them to bring a colleague with them to the meeting, they haven't taken notes at the meeting, which they need to get the employee to sign and give the copy of the notes to the employee. They haven't confirmed the verbal warning in writing. Believe it or not, you have to do that, because if you don't confirm it in writing, and if there isn't a paper trail, it didn't happen. Oftentimes we have to work backwards and go back and do the verbal warning again, or carry out the disciplinary again. Verbal warning mightn't even be needed. It might just be enough to sit down and go through the issues formally with the employee, and oftentimes you get an insight to something that was preventing the employee from doing what they were supposed to do, and the manager or owner mightn't be aware of it at all. So sometimes disciplinary processes end up in just tweaking things a little and everybody understanding each other a bit better. But if it does result in a sanction of a warning of any sort, that the outcome letter has to be written to the employee. They have to be told what the issue is, what they need to do to remedy the situation. It remains on their file for a period of whatever months, usually 6 months initially. And they also have to be given an option to appeal the outcome. So if all those things don't happen and you end up in front of the WRC, you may as well not even go in the door of the WRC, because you are going to lose. As I said earlier, if there is a complaint lodged with the WRC, the first thing they look for is the employee contract. The second thing they look for is the grievance and disciplinary procedure. And finally, then, if a disciplinary took place, they will look for all the documentation, the paper trail, and all the meetings that were held, the notes that were taken, and they are not interested in, well, I told them this on the phone or whatever. You know, what is down in black and white is what they're interested in. But intervention at an early stage can generally prevent it ever getting that far. That's where I come in. My whole focus is on preventing companies having to be in front of the WRC. But unfortunately, sometimes I get a call when I don't hear anything about it until the letter from the WRC is there that a complaint has been made, or that they're coming in to do an audit and the paperwork isn't in place. So I would encourage people, always put a phone call in, put an email in, just to get a steer in the right direction so that you don't end up in hot water. And I think we move on then to people support. Was that my next bit, I think? Performance management, if we just move on there. Oh yeah, well, just a little bit there in performance management. A couple of companies use me to meet with their staff one-to-one. I thought it was ridiculous initially when a company asked me to do it, to meet with their staff one-to-one to see how everything is going, because I saw it as being something that happens anyway in the company. And the particular company, they were a PR agency that asked me to do it. First of all, there was about 10 employees, and the owner had very much an open door policy. So he asked me would I meet with them individually. I told him I would. I told him he was wasting his money, but actually it turned out he was right and I was wrong. So I meet with those employees now once every 3 months, and it is an opportunity for the employees to air little issues that they might think are trivial to bring to management, and we work it out between us as regards what they can do. I give them a little bit of support around if they're having an issue with a colleague or whatever, around how they could possibly manage it. So I have 3 or 4 companies now that I do that with on a quarterly or biannually basis, and it seems to work very well. And the client and the employees feel that they're supported as well, that HR isn't all just about what management want, that it also includes them. So that works quite well too. And moving on to the dreaded pandemic, COVID guidance. Well, none of us are experts on this, so we've had to muddle through this together. Now, as time has gone on over the last 18 months, I have helped companies to develop remote working policies, and now more recently, thankfully, COVID returning to work policies and the do's and don'ts around being back working in the place of work, whether it's an office or wherever. And also, I would field calls from customers on queries they have or issues that their staff have around COVID, like, I didn't get vaccinated, I don't want to work in an office with other people, I want my own office. Or I know Joe Bloggs hasn't been vaccinated, I don't want to work beside them, I want them to wear a mask, all those type of things. So some of them, the answers seem very logical, but again, if it's a new area and if it's an area that I haven't dealt with before, or that I'm not 110% certain on, I would always run that past the likes of IBEC, who would just have the most up-to-date current information. So in that situation where the individual chose, and it's their right not to be vaccinated, but the company couldn't facilitate them being in an office on their own, the employee wanted everybody in that particular office. It was an accounts department. They wanted everybody in the accounts department to wear a mask. It wasn't company policy that everybody had to wear a mask, so that couldn't be brought in. So the company did what the company could do, which was keep as much distance apart. So the 2 meters plus, actually, which they were able to facilitate that. And I wouldn't say everybody was happy, but everybody was more happy than they were initially. So it's things around COVID and new areas like that. It really is a work in progress. So we get the best solution that we can with the best advice that's out there. And I'm happy if I don't know something. My father-in-law used to say there's no such thing as an expert. I tend to agree with him on that. So I would never claim to be an expert in any area, but anything I can do to help companies in any way with their staff, from when they come in the door to when they go out the door, if they do, I'm happy to do that. And as I said, as little or as much as I need to support companies, I'm more than happy to make them self-sufficient, to give them the tools, tell them what's right and what's not right, and let them do it themselves internally at a more efficiently and less cost, if that's better for the company. But I'll always be in the background to answer any questions. So on the subject of questions, I think we have a couple of questions, Michelle, that came in earlier on.
Yes, we do. Thanks, Teresa. First one is surrounding employment contracts. And the question is, what are the main areas of concern for employers to focus on that may potentially cause any grievance in the future?
There are 5 or 6 things that have to be included in contracts. Now, generally, contracts can be like everything, as long or as short as you want them. There are key things that have to be included in contracts: the person's start date, what their job is, and a little bit about what their duties are in that job, who they report to, their pay, what their salary is, and when they get that salary and how they get that salary, and annual leave and rest break entitlements. Those are the type of things that have to go in the contract. And then in addition to that, we always put in like the probationary period, so the employee knows what to expect, that within that probationary period, it is an opportunity for them to see if they like the job, and it's an opportunity for the employer to see if they're a good fit for the job. So it's important that that probationary period is there. We would always refer to the grievance and disciplinary procedure as well. And there might be other company-specific points that we put into contracts, like some contracts, they want people to wear specific uniforms. They don't want them to wear other things. I did work with a mechanic who wouldn't let the guys wear hoods because they were a health and safety risk. Obviously not smoking if it's a customer facing business, or not smoking outside the business. So there's lots of little things that are important to individual companies, but there are 4 or 5 key things, as I say, that have to go in. Generally, contracts I would issue would be about a 4-page document. Obviously, if it's a fixed term contract, if it's for just a period of time, it's most important that you put that into the contract, the start date and the end date, and that you specify that employment isn't guaranteed beyond that point, because sometimes that is just spoken to the employee that, well, we have a job for a year, but they might be issued with a letter, they mightn't even get a contract, and it might never say that it's going to end. And unless it says it's going to end, the employer cannot terminate that employment at the end, when they want to. So there are key things, but some companies want little additional bits added, and that's I suppose where I come in, that I can guide them around ways of wording it, or whether it should go in the contract, or whether it should be issued in a different letter, or whatever. Was there another one, Michelle?
There is, yes, yeah. The next one is, the question is, are there any free templates or frameworks that you would guide startup companies towards for developing an employee handbook?
There are, now I haven't particularly used them myself, but I know there are templates. Actually, the only time I really looked for one myself was when I was doing up the remote working policy, and I went online to see could I get anything, because it was something I hadn't done before. And I did download a couple of things, but they were little or no help to me because they were too vague and too generic. They weren't specific enough. But there are definitely contract templates out there. Now, some you pay for, some are free. I would just, like anything that, generally speaking, something is better than nothing, but that mightn't always be the case, because there could be something in the contract that you get online, or the handbook that you get online, that might actually be relevant, or what actually exists in your company. So if you are going to use any templates like that you get, whether you get them free or you pay to download them. Like, for example, on my website, I'd have a couple of contract templates. I will be adding more stuff to it, but I have a couple of contract templates that people can download. Now, there is a charge for that, but some people are happy to just do that themselves rather than engaging somebody else to do it for them. But I would know that those contracts are good and they cover everything they need to cover, whereas I couldn't say other contracts online, unless I look at them. But I'm more than happy if companies want to do that, because I'm all into spending less and no point in wasting resources. But if companies do see contracts or employee handbook templates online, I would say tweak them to suit yourself. And if you want to run them past me, just so that I can point out, do include this or don't include this, I'm more than happy to do that. But just be careful that it does cover what you need it to cover, and more importantly, particularly with the employee handbooks, that it's not including something that doesn't exist in your company. So I don't know, there might be something about medical insurance or life assurance or some, it would depend on where it comes from, or sick pay, and that mightn't exist in your company at all. So just read them carefully and tweak them to suit your needs. Anything else, Michelle?
There is, yes, yeah, thanks, Teresa. Next one is, you referred in your presentation that not all companies may need an actual employee handbook. You mentioned key policy documents might be sufficient, but if you do want to create an employee handbook, what are the first steps in creating such a document?
The first steps really would be, I would say, those key policy documents that you have to have. Well, obviously, the beginning of the handbook is usually a little introduction to the company, welcoming the staff member, and then there's little housekeeping things, letting them know when the business opening hours are, whether, what the situation is regarding key holding, and there might be flexi time, or there might be building related general housekeeping little points that would be helpful to have included in there. But then as regards policies, what I would say is the key policies that you legally require are the ones like health and safety, anti-bullying, disciplinary and dismissal, or disciplinary and grievance, I should say, the ones around the statutory leave, so annual leave, sick leave, maternity, parental, paternity, all those. So ensure all those are in it, first of all. And then the best way, I suppose, is to think about your business and to think about what it is that's important in your business. So while it's an employee handbook, it doesn't have to be all about HR and HR policies and legislation. You can have other operational things in it. Like I would work with a lot of hospitality businesses. So they would have a lot of policies around the serving of alcohol, and if people are under the age, the staff I'm talking about, that it's very, very strict that they would only collect glasses and clear tables and all that type of stuff. And at a point in time when they reach whatever age, 18, and they get to work behind the bar, then and only then are they allowed to serve alcohol, and there'd be certain do's and don'ts around checking IDs and all that type of thing. The handbook then, and you can always add to the handbook. So if you do decide to have a handbook / operations manual, you can always add to it. And particularly now when a lot of that documentation is stored virtually, it's quite easy to add to it. And I suppose one important thing to say about handbooks and policy documents, it's important that you have something from the staff confirming that they have received it. So at the bottom of all my contracts, I would put in a couple of lines to say, acknowledging that attached to this contract are X, Y, and Z policies, or the handbook, or the operations manual, or whatever it is. And in signing below, I confirm that I have received it, and I'll read it, and I'll inquire from management if I have any queries. So if you are issuing policies or handbooks separate to the contract, just make sure you get something signed by individual staff members confirming that they got it. Because again, if you're in front of the WRC or you're dealing with an issue, unless you can prove that the employee got that documentation, then they didn't get it. Yeah, even if it's issued to everybody company-wide once every 12 months, if you don't have proof that that particular employee got it, then they didn't get it. So that would be just that bit of advice on doing those policy documents or employee handbooks separate to a contract. So just to get the signature from all staff. Anything else, Michelle?
Yes, the last one for now, it's actually very similar to what you've just answered in terms of they were asking what are the main items to include in the employee handbook, but also is there anything that should not be included?
It's hard to be specific on what shouldn't be included, but if something doesn't apply to most of the staff, then I wouldn't put it in. So you might have an entitlement to something like, well, I was going to say company vehicles, but that one probably isn't too controversial. But you might have something, you might have your senior managers might be entitled to join a pension once they're there X period of time. So above a certain level, you might say you're entitled to join a pension. I wouldn't put that in a handbook. I would issue it individually to the staff, because you don't want to disgruntle other staff just because they're employed in a different role. They might not be entitled to it. Now, there is an awful lot involved in equality and treating people fairly and all of that, but at different levels, employers can give incentives and entitlements to people in different areas that other people aren't entitled to. So if there are things like that that don't apply across the board, and if they were in a handbook, they could potentially cause issues for staff, I wouldn't include those in a general handbook. I would issue those more one-to-one with the people that they are relevant to, or the people that they apply to. Other than that, anything that is likely to change regularly, so more operational things, that the ways of doing things, if they're likely to change on an ongoing basis, I would just have a document, more of an operational document that, you know, can be tweaked and it's kept in a particular place or issued to people at a particular time. So just things that change regularly, I wouldn't put in an employee handbook either. So more things that are there and are unlikely to change for a period of time would be my advice.
That's great. Thanks, Teresa. That's it for now.
Thanks very much, Michelle. So obviously, I think the next slide has my contact details. So if anybody has any queries, they're more than welcome to ring me or email me. And Michelle will probably forward you on my details afterwards. Don't ever be afraid to pick up the phone if you have a simple query. I'm more than happy to help. And thanks very much for listening to me today. Have a good day. Take care.
Great. Thanks very much, Teresa, for giving us the update. It was a top-level view on HR policies, and we're just on the nick of time at 45 minutes, which I was trying to say to you, we would keep it to that. But I think there's a couple of key messages. Employee contracts are super critical, and also the grievance and disciplinary procedures are critical. But I think it's also, you know, what's written down, what's signed off, and to some extent, the questions and answers brought out a lot of important tips that Teresa was bringing in today, which are critical for small startups that are taking on staff. And as I said earlier, we have over 20 new hires employed in the iHub this year, added to the companies that are here, and each of those need some level of what was discussed this morning. So thanks again, Teresa. And the website, indeed, you had it there, was abbeyhr.ie. If there's any questions, Michelle will divert them directly to you afterwards. I should say as well that there are simple solutions available to this, and I think that's what Teresa was, you know, talking about this morning. There doesn't have to be big costs here. Everyone understands, including ourselves, critically, that we have small startups here. Funding is tight, but I think Teresa has options there to fit within that, and that there are simple solutions available which will work for you and for your staff. So thanks again, Teresa, for that, for giving up your time this morning. I also want to thank Turlock and Michelle for looking after the event and planning it and managing it. And that's all from me from today, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.